and this is a revolutionary message in psychotherapy. Self can never be damaged. It can't even be dirtied by the most extreme trauma. Doesn't matter what happened to you or what you did, self cannot be damaged. This was a life-saving message for me and my clients because I mainly dealt with men with huge trauma histories. They felt damaged like they were garbage. And Dick comes along and says, nope, who you really are cannot even be dirtied. You're like a sun on a stormy day. When the cloud parts, you're still there, undamaged. That is an incredible message to give to people who've been living in the gutter and feel like they're garbage. You know, Dick says that very clearly about self. Swedenborg says that about this place of inflow of the divine. It can't be damaged. So that's a beautiful parallel from 250 years ago.
Hello and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, spirituality, and research, and always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, presently and across time, human and non-human alike. I'm your host, as always, James Jesso. Today's episode of the podcast is going to explore the intersection between psychotherapy and spirituality. Specifically, it's going to be exploring the intersection between internal family systems therapy, spiritual healing, and the work of 16th century Christian philosopher and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Our guests for the episode are Bob Falconer, Chelsea Odhner, and Jonathan Rose. Chelsea Odhner is the Vice President of Publishing for the Swedenborg Foundation and an IFS practitioner. Robert Falconer is an IFS practitioner who has contributed significantly to the field through research and writing, and Jonathan Rose is a scholar and translator of Swedenborg's Neo-Latin works. So we have someone who represents kind of like heavy in the IFS, heavy in the Swedenborg, and right there in the middle. Collectively, they are the authors of this book here, if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, Opening the Inner World, Spiritual Healing, Internal Family Systems, and Emanuel Swedenborg. That book came out last year, 2025, and that's around the same time that I had this interview. It just, the mystery of how an interview, what it takes to get it recorded, to released, and all the things that come up in between to extend the timeline between those actions, truly a mystery. Nonetheless, we're here, and I'm excited to present the episode to you. The interview is going to start by presenting Internal Family Systems and Emanuel Swedenborg, and then we're going to get into discussing the intersections between these frames of thinking and what those intersections suggest to us about what it is to undergo a journey of spiritual healing, a journey of healing, and with a particular focus or a significant focus on effectively what Swedenborg calls the porosity of mind, or what IFS calls the multiplicity of mind. Effectively, that the mind is not a singular contained thing, but it is a space populated by many beings, most of which expressions of ourselves, various parts of ourselves. But specific to this conversation, we're going to get quite deep into discussing the beings that exist within the mind that are not of the self, what might be referred to as unattached burdens, guides, angels, demons, spirits, and so on. So throughout the course of the interview, we're going to discuss the nature of mind, we're going to discuss the nature of the self, relationship with the divine, porosity of mind, heaven, hell, freedom, salvation, and how to work with these various beings within us, both self and other, in ways that contribute to spiritual healing and living a happier, better life. As always, topics are represented as timestamped chapters on this podcast, no matter where you're listening to it, assuming it has newer podcast technology, so Spotify, iTunes, Pocket Casts, these types of places, and on YouTube. If you'd like to see the timestamps and the topics breakdown, it's going to be in the description to this episode wherever you're checking it out. And that's it for the preamble. We're going to jump into the interview very shortly. But first, I'd like to say that if you haven't already subscribed to the show, and these are the kind of topics you find interest in, please consider subscribing. Maybe it is the case that you've already subscribed to too many podcasts and you're apprehensive about adding another one to the list, and I can appreciate that. But I think you like this show. Well, geez, oh my God, I hope you like the show. I think you're going to like the show if you like this episode. So please consider subscribing on whatever platform you like to engage your podcast with. And if you've already been engaging the show for a little while and you like it, please consider leaving it a positive review. Those reviews do help other people find the show who could also theoretically enjoy the show. So that said, thank you for either subscribing and or leaving a positive review. Here is my interview with Jonathan Rose, Chelsea Odhner, and Robert Falconer on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 207. Enjoy. Chelsea Odhner, Bob Falconer, Jonathan Rose, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you.
Very happy to be here.
So you're the collective authors of Opening the Inner World, Spiritual Healing, Internal Family Systems, and Emanuel Swedenborg. A quick little interesting aside now, I believe Chelsea knows this, but Jonathan, you might not, is that, well, also Bob, but I think in particular relevance to the Swedenborg prioritized people, is that when I first got this message from Chelsea saying, hey, we've got this book coming out, what do you think? I said, well, I think that's very interesting because for the past 10 or so years that I've lived here in Kitchener, Ontario, the place that I've studied and explored dance was at a Swedenborgian church, which is one of the few in Canada, from what I understand, certainly only one in our main area. And I know the reverend there, and I see him at social gatherings. I'm like, hey, Corey, how's it going? So I just thought that was a very cool connection. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So you know Corey. I know exactly who you're talking about. That's wonderful.
Now, with that little side thing sort of shared, so each of you kind of represent a particular position, at least in the book, which is where, Jonathan, your focus is on the Swedenborgianism side of thing.
Right.
Bob, yours is on the internal family system side of things. And Chelsea, you're sort of like surfing the wave between them.
Yes.
So I figured that we'll kind of like work with that dynamic throughout the course of the questions here today. But I wanted to maybe start us off with just an explanation somewhat quickly to set the stage of, what is Swedenborgianism, what is internal family systems, and sort of a general sense of like where they overlap with each other. And I'll let you choose who talks when. Yeah.
So shall I say something about Swedenborgianism? Emanuel Swedenborg was born in 1688, died in 1772, lived in Sweden, but traveled a lot around Europe. He was a nobleman, an engineer, scientist, not the most likely guy to start having spiritual experiences, but in his mid-50s, he started having these intense lucid dreams, and then it started to break through into his waking life. He had more than one vision of Jesus, and the veil sort of thinned for him. In other words, he was able to talk to people in the afterlife while he was still here and functioning, and this went on for 29 years for the rest of his life. So he wrote and published. His published theological works are 3.5 million Latin words, which turn into about 5 million English words. So he'd been publishing and writing books before, and along the lines of science and philosophy, anatomy. So it's really a scientist. There's a book that the Swedenborg Foundation has put out called "A Scientist Explores Spirit," and I think that's a great way to put who Swedenborg is. He's still kind of got his clipboard and his lab coat, but now he's in a very different realm. And one of his greatest focuses was on what is this phenomenon of thinking and feeling? Where do our thoughts and feelings come from? And this was, a long time before Jung or Freud or anybody like that. He was really getting into psychology and the spiritual underpinnings of psychology. And so this is kind of a point of contact with the IFS, because that what goes on in the mind, what goes wrong in it, what's right with it, how to work with it. So maybe I'll stop there.
Great.
Okay, let me be the other pole here. Internal family systems is a modality of psychotherapy that was created by Richard Schwartz about 40 years ago now. And it's a parts work model, and there are many other parts work models of psychotherapy. But I think Dick carried it further than anybody before him. The basic idea is that our minds are multiple. We are much more like an orchestra than a solo singer. And that this multiplicity is not the product of trauma. It's the natural state of who we are. And it's a very good and valuable, wonderful asset. We don't want to put all the parts in a blender and come up with some bland glob of goo. That's not the model of healing. The model of healing in internal family systems is most of us are wandering around the planet as an internal civil war, and we want to turn that into a cooperating team or orchestra or band, something like that. So the basic idea is multiplicity. Dick also talks about something he calls self with a capital S, which he later said is the most important part of IFS. And that is something that's not a part. It's the witness function. It's what Swedenborg calls the place of inflow of the divine. It can never be damaged. And the model of healing in IFS is helping the person within themselves promote good relationships between that self and all their parts. And that's how we help people heal.
So great. So fun to get to respond to this question and hear both of your thoughts. So I have been around Swedenborg for my whole life. So I grew up in a intentional Swedenborgian community, a very sort of historically unique in southeastern Pennsylvania. And but then really later in my life, or in my early 20s, I guess, I kind of wanted to go off on my own and just study. I was really interested in spirituality and just studying all different forms, and then also very interested in healing. What really is involved in healing, and what's this experience of spiritual reality, and how does it interface with our material existence? And so coming from that background, Swedenborg, as Jonathan said, he had this interest in the source of thoughts and feelings, but he didn't just have an intellectual interest in that. He was all about studying his own direct experience. So I don't know if the term interoception existed in his day, but that's what he did. And that's what he wrote about. So he's reflecting on what is he feeling inside of his body? Where is he feeling it? But then somehow through this intense focus and purpose, somehow all of these other realms opened up to him. So his own inner perspective seemed to open his awareness to multiple other realms, which of course is not unique to Swedenborg. That's, many different spiritual traditions find kind of that when you do turn your attention inward, things open up to you that are not just, limited by the skull that we carry around. And so then as someone who found IFS through my own healing journey, I would have to say internal family systems is exactly the clinical approach you would dream of to ground everything that Swedenborg describes. So Swedenborg it's just really sort of amazing. And that's why I felt so drawn to seeking out a way to publish a book on the subject, because when you have the IFS lens and then you study Swedenborg, you really are seeing, okay, the words are different, but that's what he's doing. But he's seeing it also, as Swedenborg says, from this scientific lens of, he uses the word vessels. Our minds, we're made up of these vessels, and they can be turned away from the inflow of the divine, but then they could be softened, and then they open up to the inflow of the divine. But those vessels aren't this inert matter; it's your sense of yourself. So it's like parts of your identity, with their own thoughts and feelings, their own will, and way of thinking, beliefs, and things. So the number of kind of things popping that show the interconnection between these two worldviews, I guess, paradigms, and how they developed, I find very exciting. So I was very excited that Bob was willing to, and Jonathan were both willing to do this project with me.
So I want to eventually get to what at least there was a lot of things about the book that I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And things that brought me to be like, oh, that's something that I wish I thought about more often. For example, the idea that we can sort of turn our way from the inflow of the divine, as well as the sort of, in the same way that in my mind, I'm like, oh, okay. And you write in the book, turning back towards the inflow of the divine, something akin to learning to, occupy self-energy or embody self-energy, right, for example. And I'm sure we'll get into, I'll let you guys get into that, or y'all get into that a little bit more. But there was something near about the second half of the book that got me very involved. And I'll let that come up in the conversation as we go through the flow of the questions to entice the people who are listening. But I want to get a foundation for where we'll go. And that is in particular to this sort of healing aspect, right? So we could talk about these things as models for understanding the mind or navigating ourselves and so on and so forth. But one of the key crux of your book is that there's a healing that can happen here, sort of psychological healing, maybe with IFS, spiritual healing in Swedenborg, / maybe in reverse as well. But I want to get a sense of, like, what does that mean? Like, what is it? What is spiritual healing? How is IFS spiritual? What does Swedenborg say about spirituality and healing, and how these systems overlap? And of course, you can answer it individually. You can also sort of give yourself crosstalk, ask each other questions and stuff. But that's the sort of general thing we're taking a bite of now, like spiritual healing. What is that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to maybe just start us off on that. Like I mentioned, I've been very interested in what healing is, and for my own personal trauma healing journey. And in addition to having parts that are fascinated about how things work and how pieces fit together and things like that. And again, kind of historically, Jonathan mentioned Swedenborg published enormously, was very prolific in his publishing, and he was engaging with the Christian theology of his day. So a lot of what he writes about is sort of in Christian terms, but he didn't start a church, and he didn't sort of seek disciples or to teach or to, he was really just, most of his works were published anonymously. He felt this pull to put what he was learning, down on paper and share it with the world. He felt he was very sort of mission driven in that way. But so I just want to make the point that the people who engaged with Swedenborg after his lifetime took it and brought it into church contexts, wanted to sort of base their whole faith on Swedenborg's ideas. And so there's a history of Swedenborgian churches that have developed since Swedenborg's day. And having grown up in that myself, there's words that Swedenborg uses that are very sort of Christian. So it's like regeneration is one. And, or you can think of salvation, right, is a big one. And for myself, with a kind of contemplative lens on Swedenborg, I wasn't satisfied with kind of the Christian layering or understanding of those terms. And then for myself, I found I see what Swedenborg writing about, that those words are synonymous with healing. Like if I could just shake off all the Christian sort of religious salvation kind of sense of it, I see it as like what Swedenborg says is we all have inherently a personal connection to the divine, like a direct connection to the divine that we've been talking about. And that's what he says, what quote unquote salvation is developing your own relationship with that divine inflow. And so if it's so personal and it's this one-on-one experience, that's kind of not about, I don't know, kind of the just ways that I feel like religion and faith has often been about converting people to think this way or do this or that or something. I feel like when you understand it through a healing lens, it's like, yes, if we all have a connection to divine love and wisdom directly inside of ourselves, learning where our own systems resist that inflow and reject it, that naturally is where suffering exists. And then when we can work with our parts to open up to that inflow, that just starts us on a healing journey. And it's not only healing, but it also is, in psychological terms, that idea of self-actualization. This sense that when you become more fully yourself, you actually feel more joy, you feel more freedom and empowerment. And that all fits within sort of when you get down into the nitty-gritty of what Swedenborg is saying is happening when we go through this regeneration journey, as he calls it. And so it's like, I see it as the path that we're all on in life, and it interconnects all of us together in these larger communities as well. Uh, and so it's a very grand idea of healing. I feel like it's not just about, did the wound on my knee heal over? Like that's a picture of this much larger connection of each of us as a unique vessel of the divine and what that means for ourselves and our relationships in the world.
Could I go next, Jonathan?
Yes.
Please. Okay. How is IFS a spiritual system? I think fundamentally it is. And Dick, in order to be accepted by the Western therapeutic establishment, had to kind of downplay that and dumb that down and make it seem more clinical. The whole idea of self is actually a very spiritual idea. Mm-hmm. That the witness function in us. And he even says that, well, you can consider self like a particle and wave. There's our self in us, which sort of feels like a particle. But as you explore that more and more, it's more like a field. It's this vast thing that gives you access to. And he's even said sometimes, well, maybe there's only one self for all of us, for the whole universe. And we can access that through this place inside ourselves. So that's a very Swedenborgian spiritual idea. The other thing, I'm a very practical, pragmatic kind of person. And there are practical, pragmatic recognitions of spiritual reality in IFS. And Dick didn't used to want to talk about this stuff at all. He would only introduce it in level 3 trainings. And I got in trouble with the IFS community because I wouldn't shut up about it. But IFS recognizes what they call guides and what they call unattached burdens. They used to call unattached burdens critters, which I like that name a lot better. and these things parallel what Swedenborg talks about as demons and angels. They are something, when we go deep enough inside ourselves, it's like looking at the night sky. The better a telescope you get, you see all sorts of stuff, galaxies, and it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And the farther in you go, you start meeting things that are not part of your own personal lifetime history. And some of them are wonderful, inspiring. They offer guidance, wisdom, profound depths, all of that, which IFS would call guides. And then some of them can have very negative influences on us. And IFS calls these unattached burdens. Swedenborg would call them demons. And I also have a background in anthropology. In anthropology, we talked about spirit possession. Dick hates it when I talk about that. It's totally acceptable in anthropology, but you talk about that in psychology and you're in trouble.
Mhm.
But those concepts, self as a particle and a field, and unattached burdens and guides, I think are the explicitly spiritual aspects of IFS that helped me connect it to Swedenborg's work. And Swedenborg's work has had a big sort of underground influence on modern psychotherapy. A lot of people have been influenced, but they won't admit it.
Mm. Mm. The first thing I want to say is that Chelsea got me thinking about the word salve, Latin word. I'm a language nerd and a translator and editor. And salve is how people would greet each other. And it means be well or your health, or it's sort of like salut, isn't it? Where, in different languages, you say something about your health. That's directly connected with the word salvation. So it's interesting that salvation at some level does have to do with healing, health, and safety. That's another word that's in there. So anyway, it's just interesting to think about, because Swedenborg doesn't overtly, if you go to a concordance of his works, you don't have like a huge article in there on healing. It's not something that he's talking about all the time. And yet, if you associate it with that word salvation, he's talking about that all day long.
Yes.
And about the change that we go through, the rebirth and so on, as Chelsea said, in biblical terms. So one of the things I'm thinking about is that Swedenborg talks about the human psyche as being multi-leveled, that we have multiple levels, and then we also have multiple parts on each level, or complex interactions between these different parts. And Swedenborg literally says several times that each of us is like a whole family. He says we're like a household, and we have the head of household, and we have other, some parts, and he even uses the word parts sometimes. They function like servants, so there's a complex model, and he also likens the mind to a 3-story house, that you have higher and lower levels. And to me, I think, and the idea that there is a presence of the divine. So these ideas are very spiritual, and how I would frame what he says in terms of healing is that he talks a lot about what it's like when lower, quote unquote, he talks a lot in terms of lower and higher, or outer and inner, when lower or outer parts of ourselves are in charge. When you have multiple levels, the question, well, who's running the show? And when these lower or outer levels are in charge, they cause a lot of suffering and difficulty. And one of the big things is to try to get this whole thing turned upside down. He says one of the functions of suffering, all the suffering that we go through, is that it has the effect of tending to make it easier for us to, realign our priorities. I mean, I know people who, alcoholics, they wrap a car around a telephone pole or something like that. It was a life-changing event, because they look at what they're doing and how their life is going, and they think, I need to have something else running the show here. And I think that's very much like IFS, and the idea of when you, as the IFS puts it, when you get blended with a part, when a part kind of takes over, not a good, if it's a burdened or a kind of out of control part, that's not a situation you want to be in, where all of a sudden you're raging or acting out or whatever it is. And the idea of gradually, Swedenborg talks about, is very, very gradual, and actually to him it's a lifelong process and continues in the afterlife of a continual kind of purification process that goes on try to get these things rearranged and reorganized.
Mm-hmm.
He's a big fan of the Bible, and he's often talking about that the Bible has deeper layers of meaning. And a story that comes to mind is Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then they're all starving and they have to come back, and they don't recognize him because now he seems like an Egyptian overlord. And he, at one point, after a lot of interaction, invites them all to dinner, and he seats them all in the age of their order of their age around the table, and they're all kind of marveling, like, not even mom gets this right, kind of thing. Like, it's sort of who knows what order we sit in. And Swedenborg says that's a picture of how a Joseph part, which is a higher part, can organize all the part, get them in the right spot. This is where everybody belongs. And so to me, that's something about healing has to do with that reorganizing kind of the family dynamic inside yourself.
Yeah. Oh, and I might just tack on to that what Jonathan is pointing to is that these different levels have kinds of love that drive them. He sort of describes these levels of love, and that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down in terms of really interesting stuff that he says about what love needs to be at the top versus the love in the middle and what's at the bottom. And like Jonathan said, when that love that's on the outermost level ends up ruling everything else, that's when you end up having problems. But when you have it aligned, then that innermost love can flow all the way down to the outermost level. So in the same way with IFS, it's not about getting rid of parts.
Right.
It's about what is the life force that they live on? Is it from these burdens or is it from this divine inflow? So,
and that divine inflow is synonymous with being in self energy.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be an accurate alignment, because the divine qualities. In other words, it's amazing what IFS says about that self. That doesn't it possess a kind of omniscience, like it knows who all the parts are, what the parts need.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? How did it get that attribute that other parts don't have? Other parts some are quite narrow or blind to what's going on, or and that ability to just, okay, could you all be quiet for a little bit and let me talk to this one? It's in charge. And I'm interested in the point that when you're in self, you don't see yourself, like you're looking out from that perspective. It's sort of like the universal eye.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And
I want to
Swedenborg,
add something here because it's one of the striking parallels between IFS and Swedenborg. Dick says, and this is a revolutionary message in psychotherapy, self can never be damaged. It can't even be dirtied by the most extreme trauma. Doesn't matter what happened to you or what you did, self cannot be damaged. This was a life-saving message for me and my clients because I mainly dealt with men with huge trauma histories. They felt damaged, like they were garbage. And Dick comes along and says, nope, who you really are cannot even be dirtied. You're like a sun on a stormy day. When the cloud parts, you're still there, undamaged. That is an incredible message to give to people who've been living in the gutter and feel like they're garbage.
yes.
Dick says that very clearly about self. Swedenborg says that about this place of inflow of the divine. It can't be damaged. So that's a beautiful parallel from 250 years ago. So, and that's one of the things that really drew me to Swedenborg. Oh, he gets this. He sees the same stuff.
Yeah. And Swedenborg makes that point that he says where we receive the inflow, or how this inflow from the divine flows into us, is the very thing that makes it seem as though it's us. Like that's part of the design. Right. And Swedenborg philosophically says that's because the divine respects it's funny to say respects our freedom, but like freedom is so critical to this whole relationship with the divine journey that we're on. And so it kind of has to be that you're fully connected, and yet you still have agency and freedom and this like sense of identity. That's like the overarching like vessel that you are, that's made up of multiple vessels, is your unique sense of identity that has freedom. And so it can be incredibly frustrating to our parts that just want to have somebody, actually show up and like in it from an outside way. And that's maybe something we do need community, for in connection, but like you have that connection, and it'll be, you get to feel more like yourself and more connected to the divine as you start to clear away what is really like false perceptions about yourself, these beliefs that no, I am garbage. Like that's part of what gets cleared away through this process.
And I like the term self for that reason. I think it's an interesting choice that Dick Schwartz made, because you'd sort of ask, whose self? The answer would be yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's you, and it's something greater.
It's something that came to mind that I hadn't parsed together while I was reading the book, is that many, many years ago, I wrote a book it's behind me here, called Decomposing the Shadow. And it was something that came out of my work with psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And this was long before I knew anything about Swedenborg, long before I knew anything about IFS. And one of the things I talk about is the clearing away, the cleaning, the sort of emotional processing that can happen with mushrooms, that in the process brings us to a point where we can connect with what I called like the point within us that connects with the all that is all at once. And that the sort of clearer sense of connection I could build with that, the more coherently myself I felt myself as. And I'm seeing some like parallels there. Maybe
Very
I was
strong.
tapping into something that Swedenborg and Dick were, getting into before, especially with Swedenborg, long before I was born. So now, unless did any of you want to comment on that, or I'll move on to the
I
next
want to
question?
put something in here because it's one of the things I truly love about Swedenborg, and it really mirrors IFS and the way I try and live my life. That the way to approach this self, this place of the inflowing of the Lord, or the way you described it in your work, it's all about us and our blocks. And we have parts who are not willing to have this. And we need to welcome them in a loving way and help them make room. And Swedenborg has this wonderful quote. Jonathan will get the details right for us. Something like, many of us think spirit is some exotic bird of paradise. We have to travel around the planet, go into these jungles to find her. No, no, no. She's right here, and she so wants us to see her that she's brushing our eyelids with her wingtips.
That's right.
That seems like a perfect expression of something that's really meaningful to me and helps me orient towards this whole spiritual dimension of healing.
Yeah. I think a very important concept associated with that is the idea that there is there's a part of what form this divine takes is that there's a process that wants to happen in us, and if we're open to it, it will happen. It respects our freedom, but it wants it's not just random, and that helps me also because partly some sort of cognitive part of myself struggles with the idea of so many parts, and even the parts have parts, and isn't that just chaos? I mean, it's bad enough just being one person. Do I have to be a whole bunch of people? But the fact that there's this organizing presence, really helps, and positive, helpful presence there that unites. that creates unity out of this variety and strength out of the variety. Swedenborg says wonderful things about variety, and that about if everything in something, whether it's a group of people or an organism or whatever, if they're all the same, it doesn't function very well. The human body functions so well because the organs are radically different from each other. You couldn't just take your liver and exchange it for your kidneys or something and to have it do the same thing. They're very different environments, but they work together. And so the more distinct and unique and making their own contribution to the whole each of these parts is, the happier and the better, the more perfect is his language that the whole becomes.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can even parse that to the level of the cells making the organs, and even beyond the individual organ system, nervous system that is the human, the complexity of all the molecules and bacteria and fungi and animals and plants that make up the whole system that is the planet is just inconceivable. I mean, certainly not from an individual human mind and baseline state of consciousness on a conceptual level, but it all works because there is, at least in my belief, there's an intelligence that's underneath it all. Perhaps not a self-reflexive, I'm choosing this, I'm choosing that intelligence, but some sort of inclination towards what I as a human, us as humans, perceive as the beauty and the flourishing of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Swedenborg has a word for that. He uses this term correspondences, or a correspondence. He says how you can see the divine at work and learn about it through correspondences, through the way that what you just described is an image of the same essential process that's going on for each of us personally, spiritually. So even the picture of our planet in a solar system that's around this sun, that's a picture of us being in relationship with the divine, being with this divine love and wisdom. And so then that's what we experience inside as well. So he has a lot of interesting things to say about how this natural world corresponds to these spiritual realities, and so then become a way for us to learn more about it, because like Jonathan says, we're just naturally, that's the flow that we're meant to live into. And if we, so much of the process, and IFS talks about it being a constraint release process. It's a constraint release model. So it's more about us loosening our grip on thinking we have to be controlling and in charge of everything. And then when we do, then, tons of wisdom and love opens up to us, because that's just the nature of reality.
Yeah, Swedenborg points out that the 10 Commandments are, or the real sort of operational ones in the second half are just expressed as what not to do. They don't tell you what to do. Just don't do these things. That's constraint release.
Mm-hmm. So now Bob already sort of spoke to it a little bit with respect to unattached burdens and guides, but a big portion of the book, as it seems, a big portion of the way Swedenborg was thinking about these spiritual realities has to do with a term that you wrote about that I believe is pronounced porosity. And with, in IFS, we have unattached burdens, critters, guides, and with Swedenborg, we have angels and demons. And this is a very big concept, or so we'll basically say topic. And I have some specific questions about it, but to bring us into that part of the conversation, can you give us a sense of what is this porosity thing and how it affects our lives?
Can I start on that one?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
I think Dick has done a great job of introducing the idea of multiplicity and exploring the implications of that in modern therapy. And that in and of itself revolutionizes and is revolutionizing the world of modern psychotherapy. I think the next step is this idea of porosity of mind. And we have this, I believe, false belief in the West that our minds are citadels. Tanya Luhrmann, the anthropologist, calls this the citadel model of mind, that our minds are confined to this bony structure here. They're ours, they're private, they constitute our identity. Nothing comes in or out. You know, it's a fortress. This looks strong, but it's actually very brittle, therefore very weak. And if you just step back and look at that model that it's sort of born into us, it's even structured into the grammar of our languages, it's ridiculous. Every living system, every living cell is surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane. Why would our brains be different? You know, huh? Duh? What is this? But it's built in. Daniel Siegel, who talks about this, says it's so built into our language, we cannot think clearly. We need to invent a new language.
Yeah.
Swedenborg understood this in a very different language that is anathema to most modern Western academics, a very, Christian religious language. But I think stuff comes into and out of our minds all the time. And if we think we're this citadel, we hear one voice or feel one influence in our psyche, some emotion that's not really part of us, we think, oh my God, my brain's broken, and it destroys us. And we go get on meds, which turn us into jellyfish in about a decade, we have no way of dealing with this. And there's most people experience these kinds of things and they keep them quiet because, it's not acceptable. So I don't think the implications of the porous nature of our mind have been explored yet. I think that's the next step. And that's one of the places, I think in a lot of ways, Swedenborg starts where IFS stops. He explores all the weird stuff that IFS has sort of pulled back from. So that's another thing that really attracted me to Swedenborg, is that he seems to be really exploring the porous nature of mind way beyond anything modern therapy world is doing.
When Swedenborg was, in his young adulthood, his belief system, as far as we can tell, was that of the Lutheran Church, that angels were a separately created race, demons, that came from a fallen angel, but they're completely separate from human beings. They don't have gender characteristics. They don't, they just have always been there in that realm. And we may go there after we die, but we never become them, and they never become us. Swedenborg, and he also, I think, believed very much, I think everybody did, in that sort of citadel view of the mind. So when things started to happen for him in a spiritual way, one of the first things was that a voice answered his thoughts, and it shocked. Like, what are you doing in here? How do you, He thought to himself, I don't. It was something trivial, like I don't think I brushed my teeth yet, and the voice said, yes, you did. You already did that. And the shock of, what are you doing in here, and how do you know? I'm on my own. I'm in my citadel. How did you get in here? And another thing that he found was that everybody on the other side, after these years and years of exploration and seeing people he had known, many, he says hundreds of thousands of people he knew, he saw them after they passed on, how things worked out for them. And he eventually came to the point of view that there's nobody else up there. That those are us, 100,000 years from now. That's who's up there. And he does have a heaven and a hell, and his idea of hell is that those are people who chose to have that outer part dominate over the inner part, in effect. And that sounds too simplistic, but what it leads to is rage, violence, cruelty, kind of socially destructive. If the thing you love the most is torturing other people, that's antisocial feeling, and So the beings who are, he says that our minds, we are spirits living in the flesh. Other religious traditions say the same thing. And that our minds, unbeknownst to most of us, some people have thin veils, but unbeknownst to most of us, we don't realize that our thoughts and feelings are coming from the spiritual world, the world of the afterlife, and they're being influenced by angels, demons. That's where our thoughts are coming from. They don't just have, we aren't life forms in our own right, just sort of generating things. And this is just such a trivial example, but it really helps to understand little things like, as I get older, but this has happened all my life, but I'm 69 now, sometimes you can't think of a movie star's name, or you can't, think of something. And then in the middle of the night, it pops into your head, Well, what was that pop? Why, if I was in charge, things wouldn't have to pop. They wouldn't pop into your head. I would just either make that thought, or not. But that idea that these things flow in, which was such a shock to Swedenborg at first, he even complained at some point about not having mental privacy. It's just like, during his transition, it was difficult to, can't I, is this inescapable? These people know everything I'm thinking and feeling. He says it's an honest world after death. And so anyway, what he's thinking and feeling are known by these other. He even said that the angels know what he's thinking and feeling better than he does. They can sort of tell him, "Oh, well, you're sad because this reminded you of this," and so that porosity is the idea that there are other influences, showing up in our thought space, in our feelings. And in fact, he says he saw scientific experiments done in the spiritual world that if you cut off that influence, you fall down as if dead. You can't even have a single thought. We think we're thinkers. We don't, we're just the end of this chain, that flows down into the flesh here. And we have a thought. A thought is actually a huge thing to have happen. A plan to form in your head or something, that's huge. That takes more than just one little person to do that magic.
Oh, I think that's so great. I was just thinking, hearing what you're talking about, Jonathan, about bringing back this idea of levels, because Swedenborg says we have these levels of our mind, but when he says they correspond to the levels of the spiritual world and to specifically levels of heaven. So Swedenborg says there's angels, there's demons, and then there's just spirits, like people who sort of aren't at either end of the spectrum and just kind of figuring their way out, in some sort of whatever in their own process. And those can even be angelic spirits or evil spirits, so a lot of the time, actually, though, that's like the immediate spiritual atmosphere that we're in, is these kind of like in between spirits. And then he even says we sort of intentionally have some mediation from either the sort of, which really are like the worst spirits of hell, like people who really have just developed such a love and attachment and have resisted any kind of encouragement to be a little different. We kind of have some mediation from those most intense spirits, but then also the most angelic spirits are they're influencing us, but we're not readily perceptive of their influence. Swedenborg talks about how these different levels of angels have whole different languages or ways of communicating. So it's like the spirits that are kind of in the in-between, we maybe engage in something like a conversation with them. But he has this whole riff on how then what he calls this like middle level of angels, how they communicate. And then the highest or innermost level of angels, just like he says, don't they communicate like a burst of light that just has this love that comes through? You have to be on a different level in your own spirit to communicate with those angels. And so the levels of our minds are interconnected with those levels of heaven. And our sense of identity, like he said, it's a household. We he says it's sort of the problem of human history that we've gotten so attached to the lowest level, and we've gotten so focused on this outermost level. And that is actually the source of our problems. And it's the source of us thinking that we're separate and these citadel, little entities, because that's the way things appear. But we've shut ourselves off from these inner levels. But that's the whole, when you start to go inside, things just naturally start to open and encourage this sort of turning. And when it's a different mode of being. Like, I don't know if you've ever, I listened to the meditation teacher, Tara Brach, right? And when I would listen to her a lot, it was like, I was like in the sort of vibe of that. But then if I didn't listen to her for a while and I was just doing my day-to-day work, like a 9-to-5 job and got to get this done on time, I'd go and turn on a Tara Brach episode and I'd be like, I feel like I'm existing in slow motion, like it's a completely different way of being. I'm like, want to turn her on double speed just to like go at the pace that my mind is going. And like, but that's what it is internally. We get quieter. Things we have the senses. We're designed with senses to feel those inner levels and communicate with angels at those inner levels. But we just live in cultures that have completely shut that off and even condemn that, and further perpetuate this focus on the outermost level, which you can also kind of see as like that left brain, like very linguistic, just like this is that, this is the only thing that exists, is all these different parts and they're all out, for themselves. And there's a completely different way of being at those inner levels that just knows how everything is interconnected and has perception around that. So we sort of describe it in the book that you're, the little dot of your sense of self, based on the kinds of thoughts and feelings that you're having, you can start to know what level of your mind you're existing at. And just knowing that you have options, like, oh yeah, if I'm just overrun with anxiety, I'm on a very outermost level of my mind. And then there's things you can do to lift your sense of identity or bring it more inward, that whole like higher is inner. And so it becomes very practical to just know what level of the house am I living on right now. And okay, I think I need to go spend some time up on the 3rd floor to be with those heavenly angels, bring that back down, and things are going to feel different, when I revisit, the deadlines I have coming up or something, that kind of thing.
I'd like to take a little break here from the conversation and let you know that support for this podcast comes from you, the listeners, through my Patreon, patreon.com/James W. Jesso. If this podcast brings you entertainment, education, distraction, nourishment, parasocial relationships, any level of enjoyment or value, please consider supporting the show directly by becoming a patron on Patreon. This is my full-time job. This is how I earn a living. And my patronage is how I'm able to carve the time and the finances out of my days to give this podcast my all. So I appreciate very much so you considering becoming a patron by heading to patreon.com, like I said, and helping to contribute the creation of this show. All I'm asking for is the price of a cup of coffee once a month. And let's say the price of a cup of 2023 coffee. 2026 coffee is pretty expensive. So all I'm looking for is a cup of a 2023 coffee, or the cost of a cup of coffee in 2023 once a month. That would be fantastic. Everything is something, and it all contributes to me earning an income that allows me to give this what it needs to blossom. So thank you very much. An extra thank you right now will go to my patrons on Patreon that exist right now, and especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or Spotify and listed in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Those individuals give at a significant dollar amount on the Patreon page, and their name in the credit is an extra thank you for that. Before we close out this little break, if you would like to just leave a one-time donation, you could do so through a number of options, such as PayPal or Ko-Fi, and links to that are in the description to this episode as well, so check that out. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do so. Thank you very much, and Now let's get back into our interview with Jonathan, Chelsea, and Bob. Bob, you were about to jump in on a comment about porosity.
Yes,
so
thank you.
yeah.
There are many thinkers who believe that the Citadel model of mind, which we'll take as a name for the opposite of porosity, is the underlying root cause of the epidemic of mental illness we're experiencing now.
Mm.
And I think that's true.
Mm.
And even though the idea of porous mind is terrifying to most people, I think it's something we have to come to accept. If you take this step back again and look at it, the idea of a citadel model of mind is almost a definition of alienation. If
Yes.
you feel you are totally separated from the whole universe, you are alienated. And if you're alienated, there's going to be you're going to be living in an ocean of anxiety. If you are living in an ocean of anxiety, there'll start to be a crust of rage and hate and anger that comes up over that to contain the anxiety. It forms Matthias Desmet says this basic psychology is the fundamental level that all totalitarianisms depend upon.
Wow.
And Hannah Arendt said the same thing. A lot of other thinkers are pointing to this, but Charles Taylor, the philosopher from McGill, a lot of people, but they're not all coming together. There are all these arrows, I think, pointing at this same thing, which is how pernicious this citadel model of mind is. So I think the study of Swedenborg, as it comes together with IFS, can show us a way we can accept, adopt, and live from the idea, the model, the porous mind, which is, I believe, who we really are. And I think this has really deep implications and hopefulness.
Yes, and something I hasten to add is that when Swedenborg talks, he doesn't use that term porous. He expresses it in different ways, but absolutely says that that's where our thoughts and feelings are coming from. But a very key idea to him is that you not only have a choice, you, in a sense, you are a choice. And so I often think of it in my own life, in my own sort of spiritual work, as just being like the where the in baseball, is it that the pitcher, I don't know, watch much baseball, but they you suggest a certain, I think that, is it the catcher suggests a certain type of pitch, and then the pitcher just does a little nod, like a little, no, not doing it. Give me another thought. And then he suggests another one. Then, okay, tiny little nod. Yeah, we're going to go with that. That little shake of the head, even physically, I'll do it during the course of my day, because having that no, you're going to get thoughts, you're going to get impulses from all over the place. And sometimes you might get a very strong, sudden, weird desire. To some odd thing will flow into you, just sort of just a little shake of the head, or just like not doing it. Bad things happen when you're just pushed around, when you're taken over by those things. But we have a choice. And when Swedenborg talked about this exact point with other people, they said to him, well, then you're not anybody. And what are you? If it just flows in and you say yes to this and you say no to that. Swedenborg compares this to the biblical phrase that let your words be yes, yes, no, no. Anything more than that comes from evil. And I think it's very much from that point of view. Hey, it's flowing in. You say yes to the good stuff, no to the bad stuff. They said, well, you're like nothing. And Swedenborg says, I feel much more my true self since starting this practice than I ever did before. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really key and fits very well with IFS.
And that's that whole identity piece. Because I think of, when I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking of our parts. Because from an IFS practical standpoint, when you're getting to know a part, their choice matters. And they might have been identifying with this burden forever, which in a sense is an inflow of evil,
Right.
or like even if it's not a entity that's attached to you, but it is still the inflow of what's evil and false from the spiritual realms. Or they have the choice to open up to the inflow of love and wisdom, and that's a completely different perception. It opens up new possibilities for action and, who they want to be and all that sort of stuff. And so it's like the part still exists, but they get to choose what of the inflow are they identifying with.
Mm,
And then that
right.
is that healing process, like bringing that back to that whole overall thrust.
So now, correct me where I'm getting this wrong here, but I get the sense that it's possible that if Swedenborg had IFS or modern sort of look at things, he may have. Okay, so let me rephrase that instead of trying to put words in Swedenborg's mouth. I'm listening to what Jonathan said there about like every thought comes from somewhere else, and I start to feel a bit overwhelmed, even with. I have a sense. I think my default state is to lean back into what I was conditioned to believe as primary, which is the citadel of the mind, for better, seemingly for worse, actually. And so maybe there's a little bit of resistance there, but there's a sense of like, holy, I have that same question of like, well, who am I?
Yeah.
Right? But also, from what I understand about IFS, it makes it a little bit more coherent if I think less like, oh, every thought comes from somewhere else. I can recognize like, well, any given thought at any given time could be coming from one part or another part that could have more or less, sort of, handle on the reins, or the controls from one at one point or another. And that it's possible that some of these come from outside of my system, which is the kind of revelation of, I'll use a different term, the sort of interesting addition to the parts model, the peopled model of the mind that IFS introduces, that there can be things that are in there that are not of you necessarily. So, I mean, assuming I have a pretty good sense of this topic here from what I just described, and correct where I'm off base, how do we come to recognize sort of, for example, if we have an unattached burden or an evil spirit within us versus what's actually just like our own personal darkness, our personal burdens? And like, how do we come to notice the difference there? Is it clear, or is it,
That's a great question.
Yeah, great question. IFS has a couple clear answers on that. And that, I wrote a book on this, and I guess I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. This. The number one thing is intention. Parts always have a good intention, including even the parts that keep a drunk are trying to do something good. Suicidal parts are a great example. If it's a part of a person and you ask it, well, why do you want to kill him? Why do you want to kill him? Over and over, you'll eventually get to something like, I'm the last line of defense against unbearable suffering. If his suffering becomes absolutely intolerable and there's nothing else available, I can take him out. That's a good intention. We can join with that good intention and say stuff like, well, if we could help reduce the suffering without you having to kill the physical body, would you be willing to help us do that? You can join with that. All parts have good intentions, even the ones that seem really, really nasty. If it's coming from outside, if it's one of these unattached burdens, or what Swedenborg, would call a demon, it doesn't have a good intention. You keep asking it, well, why do you want to kill him? Why do you want to kill him? It would say something like, well, that means I win. Something completely snarky. And, that means, just nasty, nasty, nasty every level you go down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really important from an IFS point of view that you make totally sure it's not a part. And if you make a mistake, you assume it's a part. You don't want to be trying to cut anything out of the system or remove anything.
Yeah.
If there's any chance it's a part. So you stay with that position until proven wrong. And then the other thing you can do is you can just ask it directly. Are you a part of me? Are you a part of me? And this is, I think, the only thing they don't seem to be able to lie about, because these dark energies are masters of lying. They're great politicians and attorneys.
I just
That was snarky. I'm sorry I said that.
Was that a part?
Yeah, tack
Yes,
on to
that was a part.
the third piece that you can add in that I think Swedenborg defines, that I don't think IFS defines this, is that intention of good spirits, of guides and angels. They know they're not you, and they don't want to take away your freedom at all. So they have the utmost respect for your freedom. They're never going to tell you what to do outright. They're going to make suggestions. They might fill you with love, but they're not trying to. They go totally out of their way to respect your freedom. And so that's a really clear distinction between an evil spirit and an angelic spirit. Is it really just have its own ends? It doesn't care about your freedom. It would just like to get what it wants from you and, make you subservient to it or whatever. Whereas angels respect your freedom, and then your parts have good intentions for you, and they are your freedom, So angels have good intentions, but they want to respect your freedom, and they would never lie about that. That's not what they want. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to underscore something Chelsea just said, that Swedenborg says that those evil spirits do have an absolute desire to enslave you. They don't esteem you at all. They treat you like dirt, or like vile excrement, is a phrase he enjoys. And the not even ordinary nice excrement, really bad excrement. And and the angels esteem you, love you. They want to use, they don't even want to give you something if it might be too much for you. They just want to use what you already have. Just draw that out, turn it up a little bit. Okay, you've got that good compassion in there. Or you've got a conscience. Let's just, that's good. Sort of positive reinforcement. And so I find that helpful in terms of judging who you're dealing with. If you're just getting beat up in your mind and pointlessly, just trying to drag you down, that's a key to who you're dealing with.
And your question about, or you said, oh, that's kind of overwhelming to think about everything flowing in, and that's just the nature of our existence. And so who am I? Like Swedenborg, well, 2 points I have. One is that we are very familiar with this. We're actually so familiar with it. It's like the water we swim in already, even in this natural world. Mm-hmm. And then 2, Swedenborg says, in the spiritual world, children who are, because he says, people who, anybody who dies young before they fully reached adulthood, they go immediately to heaven, he says, and they continue to develop their own sense of self, but in a spiritual realm but they still have to face any, what IFS would call like legacy burdens that they have. But it's critical for children to learn how to say no to influences that are coming in. So they even sort of challenge children in like these exercises of like, I'm going to try to get you to do something and you have to tell me no. It's kind of like stranger danger or something that we might do with kids, in this realm. But that's so critical for developing that sense of choice and knowing that everything flows in. So in our world, it's like when you grow up and you go through adolescence and young adulthood, I think we all we go through a sense of a crisis of identity because we realize, who the heck am I? I'm just the product of my parents. I'm what my culture has always told me to do. Like I was given orders, go get married, get the job, go to school, like do the thing. And you're like, well, who the heck am I if I'm just literally the product of what everybody else has told me to be? And am I anything other than literally the genetic composition of my 2 parents, right? Like we go through these crises of identity, I think, on purpose, because that is how we develop our own, we have to say no to what's flowing into us. And on a day-to-day basis, it's like I open up social media and what am I going to choose today to like listen to the inflow of all of the random memes, like whatever political memes or anything like that, or like the messages, the influences, we're being constantly assaulted. And, or you can use your choice to find sources of spiritual inflow that do connect you with more deeper or higher realms and all of those, that spiritual influence that's there, but it naturally doesn't seem as loud to us because it's on an inner level. And so when you exercise that in this world, uh, that's exactly what we're doing. It is a spiritual act that you're doing when you do that. And even the other piece about our identity in it is that the way that the inflow works is it flows into our memory. Just how I said, like, when the inflow of the divine comes in, it makes it seem as though it's us, but it's actually the divine. That's the same thing with other spiritual influence most of the time, is you think, I need to be really anxious about this right now. You experience it as yourself, but that's actually spiritual influence, a connection to spiritual communities that you have that similarly feel that anxiousness. But it's going to have your memory. It's going to feel like you. It's going to have your details in there about your job, whatever. So when you start to realize, if you're ever feeling hopeless, it might have your particular details of your life of why you might feel hopeless. But when you realize there's all these people in the world who are feeling hopeless just like you and having the same, their own personal details added to that, even that helps to sort of unblend from the parts that are feeling attached to the hopelessness and can bring compassion to that whole experience of like, there's a spiritual aura here. There's that. And so what is the most loving way to be with this feeling or these thoughts that I'm noticing I'm having in myself? And I think that's how we connect with bring the divine inflow into that experience. If I'm making sense. I know that was kind of a lot, but
something that helps I know the multiplicity thing is so strange in a way, but it really eventually helped me in the sense that when I was younger in particular and was trying to think of myself, I'm trying to get to know myself, late teenage years, early 20s, whatever, and trying to think of myself as one thing. What is this one thing that I am? And I think, oh, well, I'm good at music. Okay, that's what I am. And then I see myself function well in some other situation. Oh, I gave a good talk or something. And then I go into a rage, and then it would be so difficult for me because it's like, well, no, if I'm only one thing, then I'm horrible. I'm a horrible person. And I don't get how this could be that same one thing that just played that great music, or I don't even get how these things work. And starting out, oh no, these are different. The idea of multiple levels, I think that's where it started for me, was just the idea that there's higher and lower and they have different values. A friend advised me years ago is to sort of take mental snapshots of myself in different states and just sort of lay them out from time to time and just see, this is not even one person, understanding that not only is it not one person, these things don't even agree with each other. As Bob said, civil war. So, there are, I have parts that are very altruistic, have been since I was 12 years old, very much wanting to help the world. And I have other parts that are just quite antithetical to that, self-centered and judgmental. So the multiplicity, as bizarre as it is, has helped me sort of feel like, I can be one thing and I can have all these, this whole group in there and work with these different parts, but also be detached. That wonderful detachment that takes place when the self looks at a part and interacts with it is a very healing thing.
Okay, I want to.
There's
The idea of multiplicity that Jonathan's talking about is scary enough for most people. They run the other way. And then when we go to porosity, in addition to that, like you were saying, James, this is feeling pretty overwhelming. And there's a very important thing in anthropology. Much of the stuff in anthropology about spirit possession is very local, but just to one tribe or one culture. But one thing that seems pretty general is that the hidden demons are the most powerful ones. These dark energies get power by staying hidden. And when we can bring them into the light and into our awareness, we're a whole lot safer. And that can help people who have this feeling of being overwhelmed by this idea of porosity. Actually, our way to start feeling comfortable and safe with the realization that our minds are porous is to shine light in these directions and turn towards them with curiosity. And if we try and just go, that actually makes us more dangerous, more in danger, and more vulnerable. So the hidden demons, the unconscious desires are the ones that are more likely to take us over and run our lives.
This is we got about 25-ish minutes left here on our recording time, and I got a couple of questions I want to get into, and one of which is going to be like something on the practical ends. Like I want to finish off on something really practical with what people can walk away from this conversation knowing that they can do, like even before the podcast is over, that they could start doing. And another question has to do with the central topic of the show, which has to do with psychedelic plants, fungi, molecules. But this next one, I think, is important to bring in because of what Bob had just said around, the most sort of dangerous demons are the ones that are most hidden. I don't talk too much about, like angels or demons or entities. Periodically we'll go into it here on the show, but I don't talk about it much, and I don't talk about it too much in my own life. And it has, at least consciously, as little to do with my perceived sense of other people judging me on my beliefs in that respect. It has more to do with this sense that, the one thing perhaps, and again, this is my assumption, so correct me here, but is that the one thing more dangerous than the hidden demons remaining hidden is to have someone only have enough information about the idea of demons or evil spirit possessions to be afraid of it without any sense of being empowered by that knowledge. And that I don't feel particularly competent most of the time to ensure the discussion comes up with the sense that people now feel competent to not be just blatantly afraid. For myself, maybe it's from my upbringing in a Jehovah's Witness. My father was a Jehovah's Witness, so I had an upbringing where demonic and demons was like a big part of, like, that is why you can't do this, and this is why this is bad, and so on and so forth. And then in my teenage and early 20 years, really going deep into horror movies, especially demonic possession movies. Loved that stuff. And it also, planted some shit in there. I'm sure at least you've seen some of the imagery, but I imagine I'm not alone in the sense that when I think about an evil spirit or a demonic spirit or a demon, I got some pretty gnarly stuff in there that gets real frightening if I let the imagery and the understandings I have in here take over without that sort of sense of, I'm not sure, not the what to do about it, but the sense that there isn't necessarily reason for me to just be only afraid.
Yeah. Can I go first? I have a problem. I have to get off in about 5 minutes. I thought we were only going to go for an hour, and I allowed an hour and a half, and I have to get off in 5 minutes because I'm teaching a class. Okay. And I'm really glad you brought this up. It brings up a super important point. In IFS and in my work, what and Dick says this too, these dark energies, unattached burdens, only have power when we're afraid of them. That's how they get power, by scaring us. And when we're no longer afraid of them, they lose all power. They're like that wonderful scene in The Wizard of Oz, where they finally get to the wizard's castle and there are all these huge things going rah, rah, rah. And a little dog runs over and pulls the curtain back. And the great big voice says, "Pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain."
Yeah.
It's a lot like that, I think, most of the time. So when you're not afraid of them, they lose all power. So the thing to do is not to try and bulldoze and bury the parts of you who are afraid. It's to go to them with love and compassion and welcome those terrified parts home to yourself. And actually, this is an incredible benefit that having these kind of unattached burdens brings to us. We get to find all the deeply buried, terrified parts of ourselves. So that's the real nature, I think, of the work with unattached burdens or demons or however we're going to call them, entities, spirit possession, is finding all the parts of us who are terrified, welcoming them with love so that they feel well connected. And when there's no more fear left, these things are very easy to help go on their way.
Yeah, one of the things that makes me think is the Swedenborg says this remarkable thing. I think so many movies where you have an antagonist, it builds and builds and builds until you finally, maybe you're facing lesser ones, and then you finally get to the arch, the worst of the worst at the end. Swedenborg says that Jesus went through a process of dealing with evil spirits, and you see that overtly in his dealing with people's spirit possession and so on. Swedenborg says that he dealt with the worst ones when he was a little child, and it went absolutely the other direction. By the time that he was at the end, what he was dealing with was not the worst devils; it was the rather disappointing aspects of the highest angels. That's what he was dealing with at the end. They're actually quite easy, and he says that in the spiritual world, literally, there are little kids who deal with these guys. Like I said, you're horrible. They're just.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I love the spirit in IFS of curiosity, because I think that if you're curious, you're not afraid. If you're afraid, you're not curious. And that idea of curiosity, that's really helped me with these. If you can, okay, fascinating. I see that you're drooling. You have big fangs. How is that for you? And
Yeah, I just think it's sort of interesting I kind of get the sense of how when people first interface with this idea that there are evil spirits and demons, we apply the same kind of Citadel model of mind and kind of combine it with that idea. Like we still hold on to our perception of the way we think the world works on this level. And then we try to fit this idea of evil spirits and demons into it. And so then our whole perception is warped because we think that what evil spirits and demons are like some burglar coming and breaking through the windows, and like whatever, raping or killing you or something like that, right? Like just really, we think of it in very material terms. And what Swedenborg says is actually you need to understand how the whole spiritual world works is like that when you have, he even says you have to take the ideas of time and space out of it, that the spiritual world exists outside of time and space. And that it's not as much as there's any evil influence, there's as much and more good and loving influence going on. And he says that we're always, our freedom is the most protected thing. So we're kept in this equilibrium. And so like when what Swedenborg says is when you understand you've got the whole picture. If there's evil spirits here, that means there's angels who are 10,000 times more powerful than evil spirits with you all the time. And already on your side, already protecting you from the evil spirits. He says, like, if that weren't the case, this would not be happening. Life would have ended a long time ago. So even for our little tender parts who are afraid, that's just, first of all, a warped perception, like that it's not the full picture. And so, older parts of us, or, ones that have a little more access to self energy, can bring this awareness of like, that is not the whole picture. You're looking at a little keyhole and you're seeing one little slice that's a big, scary monster. But if you could see how connected and already protected you are by love, that changes the whole relationship. And he says, and this kind of gets into that practical point of like, if you understand how everything's flowing in, then if any evil is flowing in, you just send it back. You just say, no thanks, like return to sender. You're not allowed in here. And then you welcome in that goodness that is there. Yeah.
Bob.
I gotta go. How do I stop this call without messing up the recording?
You could just, if you could just leave it open, you can turn off your camera and mic, which should be right next to your name. Yep.
Okay. I've got to start another call in 4 minutes.
Okay. Make sure you also, actually, I can turn off your mic. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate your time today.
It's great to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you
thanks,
all.
Bob.
Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that, Chelsea. I know that this is the recognition of like the sort of the positive energies, the sort of the not dominance, but like the greater population of positive influences around is a nice reminder. Now, unfortunately, as Bob has just left, Bob is our kind of like I would say like resident psychedelic guy here. So maybe this next question we won't be able to explore too deeply, but I'll like listeners will be alerted now and later that I have a whole other interview with him on IFS and psychedelics.
Nice. Nice.
But what are your thoughts here? So, because when I think about the porosity of mind, even if I didn't already have a sense of what we've been talking about here with angels, demons, unattached burdens, guides, etc., I feel like anyone who's done any kind of like explorations into the psychedelic realms recognizes that at least on the perceptual end of things, it seems as though there's a softening of our perceptual boundaries, our boundaries of self, and there's a greater sense that one maybe identify as, but that one can be in communion with stuff that normally is not a part of their mind, be it the spirits of the forest or entities in other realms and so on and so forth. And anyone who's participated in any sort of psychedelic ceremonial work in more indigenous or traditional contexts, there's a real sense of protecting the space from the influence of negative energies. Now, sorry, I'm hearing some voices in the background. It kind of caught me off a bit.
Is that Bob? Is that
no?
I think it was me. I can.
Oh, it's on your end. Okay.
Anyway, so with that said, do either of you have any particular thoughts on either in the navigation of porosity of mind, or even in the sort of the development of a more sort of like coherent or stable place within which you can say yes, no, return to sender? Do you have any sense of that with respect to psychedelic molecules or plants, fungi?
I could offer some thoughts. I know Bob has talked before about, is it the NRM or something? What is that? There's some part of your brain.
Default mode network.
Default mode network. That's what, sorry. Yeah, so the default mode network that seems to be disrupted or affected by psychedelics. I'm very excited that there's such tremendous research going on now. And I'm fascinated that it seems to work best in a controlled environment. In other words, the environment matters a tremendous amount. taking acid and then going to a party or something is very different than having two therapists or sitting with you all day. The outcome is
or sitting by yourself in a forest. Very different experiences.
Yeah, that's right. Very, very different experiences, and so it is affected by that, and that sense of the way it can shut down your sort of normal and see life with new eyes and experience yourself and your surroundings in a different way. It does seem akin to a spiritual experience in a bottle, so to speak. In other words, there's a way to access these kind of experiences, and so I'm fascinated at the work that's being done. I don't know all about it, but in trauma recovery, with going through these sorts of experiences and then holding the same thing that's caused you so much suffering in a different light because you're in an altered state. I think there's something profound about that. That idea of being able to change your perception.
Mm-hmm.
Swedenborg talks about inflow and the fact that inflow is it's in accordance with the state of the receiving vessel, the way that he puts it. So he sees us as vessels. And when you change the vessel, you change your brain chemistry. I don't know how these things work, but when you change the vessel, you're getting different perception. But I am interested that what they found is that the care of having people help you through this, or as you say, being yourself in an environment of beautiful nature and that sort of thing, helps the kind of experience that you have or the kind of presence that comes.
Yeah. And I think of what actually comes to mind is Jill Bolte Taylor's work, My Stroke of Insight, and how she's a neuroscientist who had her whole left brain shut down from a stroke. And so then she was just entirely in her right brain mode of perceiving reality. And it is similar to that sense of just connectedness and this depth of wisdom and insight. And so whether it's like a psychedelic experience or something medically occurs or a near-death experience or a deep meditative state, even just like an intentional meditation, I really see that as like, that is spiritual reality. And that is kind of what Swedenborg is getting at when he talks about these inner levels of our minds. And he says our inner self, because he says we have our outer self and our inner self. And he says our inner self is just this ocean of spiritual, knowledge, experiences, interconnectedness, everything. So like, I think in a lot of ways when you're in a psychedelic experience, you are just opening up and getting to kind of swim in your inner self. But then that inner self is being connected to whole spiritual communities. So when you're in that state, when you're at that inner level of perception, angels are much more readily able to be connected with you and, interfacing with you in a more conscious way and influencing your perception on things. So I think that, our ability to receive new perspectives on our life and really get like spiritual downloads happens readily. But that's just something that's always available to us, and then this amazing thing about how our world naturally creates plants with chemicals that can induce a state of that kind of openness. I don't sort of think of that the chemical is what's creating the experience, but that it's opening up our minds, like Jonathan said, the vessels of our minds to be perceptive and receiving the spiritual reality that's going on. And I think as what people find with psychedelic assisted therapy is how you go into that state. And again, it's naturally healing. It kind of has this intention to heal us. It has this, obviously there can be the overwhelming and intensely negative experiences. But even that with awareness is like new insight on things, even though it can take a long time for kind of our outer selves to integrate those negative experiences. But like that, so much of it is we kind of are stepping into this flow that Swedenborg says is what all of heaven, the angels, the divine is always just this momentum toward healing and wanting to help everybody, and especially those of us that, for the most part, live very outward, external oriented lives. Like we miss out on so much. So we're given an opportunity through something like a psychedelic experience. Like heaven's going to take every opportunity it gets to to help us see things in a different way and help us out.
And again, from an abundance of ignorance, but my understanding is that a lot of ancient religions, tribal religions, use these practices. But I'm also interested that it wasn't like recreational use, or what, it was done in a setting of ritual, and you'd have a shaman or someone, someone sort of take you through the experience. It would have a purpose. You'd establish your purpose ahead of time, and purpose seems very important. So such a useful tool. I'm fascinated that for a while there, I guess the research shut down, right? It became illegal for a while, and then it came back online. And so I'm excited about what I've been hearing about with trauma healing in particular coming out of that research.
Well, I mean, with respect to the recreational part, it's interesting because if we look back to the sort of traditions that used it to say that there was or wasn't recreational use, it's almost like imposing a particular, like a modern viewpoint on it, where we have this division between recreational, therapeutic, and ceremonial and entertainment. These are different things, where its use was over time integrated into the culture, and the culture was integrated around the uses of these substances. So even what on the acute, like in some ways could have been like blatantly recreational, it was just for the joy of doing the thing, wasn't recreational because it was just a part of where these plants fit inside of the traditions of the community and stuff. So, I mean, that's an aside. But
Yeah.
it was some of it is joint, right? In other words, with other people, right? It's
collective, right. And I guess I'll fill the void that was left over by Bob's departure with my own ideas here, which is that I think there's something listening to this discussion around like guides and spirits and so on and so forth, evil spirits, demons, angels, that there's something about the ability of these plants, which I would perceive as being their own living beings that have a kind of manifestation through us when we consume them. Some more than others have a sense that there's an other there we're interacting with, can become like allies when we do the work of moving through the darkness, the dark energies that are of it, but also of ourself, such that we could get to the positive aspects of it. And then ongoingly, through the porosity of mind, we could have at the very least, a connection with its energy in us as we move through our world, a relationship with the plant spirit, and even more so when we trust our relationship with it as we navigate whatever realms it opens us up to, which includes, in my conception of it, realms well and beyond what's just happening inside of my personal psyche. As much as sometimes that freaks me out, I also am like, oh, but that's also just like what it is. And that's okay as well.
Yeah, I think it's really, people have wondered and have projected on Swedenborg. Was he taking any substances? Like what was his substance use, if anything? And like, Jonathan is more of an informed scholar on this, but I think for anybody who wants to explore Swedenborg's works and you read about his spiritual experiences, which are often uh, he interweaves them with his kind of more philosophical teaching. But he'll then say, okay, now I'm going to tell you about something that happened. And it's just like, they're just the most wild psychedelic experience. I mean, because I just mean they're not psychedelic. It's just spiritual reality. And that's so just the way that we work. Like the inner realm, he says, is full of images and representations. And so whole spiritual communities can appear like a single individual or maybe like a single animal. And like, but then you get to know it and you realize, oh, I'm connecting with a whole community of spirits here. And, or maybe a representative of the community has come to talk with you about something. Like it's very sort of fluid, and yet cogent. Like I think sometimes within psychedelics, we're having these experiences, but it's almost a bit dreamlike where like there's blurred edges to things or something. Like I think with what Swedenborg is experiencing, it's just as wild and weird. He like has a conversation with a 3-headed turtle, and learns some deep spiritual insight. But he's there. He just has waking consciousness and then is writing it down. And like, this is really useful stuff, And so if anybody wants to go on a little tour of that, I encourage you to read some of Swedenborg's direct spiritual experiences. Cause I think what I mean by all that is that it normalizes it. Like our society has so peripheralized these quote unquote weird experiences, or like that's somehow that's what's weird, it's fringe or something. And my overall takeaway from Swedenborg is that no, that's like actually the most normal thing. Like, and what's weird is our strange, like, collared shirt and tie, go to work at 9 a.m, like just this very outward culture. Like those are just two very different things. And so when you start to learn how to navigate your inner realm, it means kind of interfacing with a lot of symbolism, understanding and kind of using what we might call telepathic communication, but really it's this like nonverbal communication that happens in the inner world. Like there's and I can speak for Bob here that he says like us learning how to navigate this inner realm is essential for our healing. Like that is the key to to healing, and is not to no longer ostracize it, but to actually like bring it in rather than thinking that it's. I think of this in terms of our society and how we are around grief and death, like these really core parts of life that naturally bring us into these like liminal states, and we kind of push them to the edges. We've tried to sort of create this sanitized life, and yet actually more sense of healing and wholeness can happen when we actually normalize that, bring it into the center. Like that's just human experience. And so let's explore that, like with this curiosity, rather than try to cut ourselves off from it.
Yes, and
Jonathan, pardon the interruption. I'm going to take the reins here and maybe leverage that as I want to bring us to our final question and a close here with respect to our recording time. And perhaps what I'm about to ask, what you're about to say perfectly addresses it. I want to end with this, a sense of practical, like what people can walk away trying to bring on board for themselves. Now, this could just be perspective. It could be direct practice. We've talked about the porosity of mind, the inflow of the divine, of the connection with self energy, the relationship we have with parts with angels and demons. Out of all of this, what do you think for the listeners is a good sort of like, well, try this, like this thing. This is like a very high ROI thing to keep in mind walking away from this conversation, to really start pulling what we've talked about today into a positive application in their lives.
Yeah, I love that question. The some of the things in these thoughts that have affected me are the idea of trying to approach myself and very much also other people with compassion and curiosity. Really trying to be in that awareness that we talked about, that consciousness of just looking as objectively as possible at what's going on inside, and noticing other people and noticing how we're reacting to them. And I found I couldn't put it into words, I don't think, but I found it like in particular situations where there's just some people in my life who trigger me in various, they can kind of plug me in or whatever it is, and actively just trying to reflect in that moment, even when that's active, even when a part is sort of blending, to reflect on the fact that there is a part of myself that's not in this. Like Bob said, that sun above behind the clouds, and try to just ask to get into that state, to hold this person, myself, with compassion, and observe my reaction, but not embody it. If it's going to lead to an argument, or whatever it is, kind of thing. Just trying to. I found that quite effective. Just to approach difficult interactions in that way. Sometimes before going into something, I'll say a prayer or have a thought about wanting to be in that state of self, especially when you're dealing with a whole room full of people who may have various different opinions about whatever you're bringing, just to try to be centered. And if I may, you seem like someone yourself is very centered, and you're doing this interview, and I like that quality. I think there's some intention there that just helps.
Yeah, that's awesome. What comes to my mind from like a really trying to think about it practically, and I have to just think about, well, what's helped me? I with again, it's starting to act, or even act as if all of this is true, right? Like thinking about your experience and saying, even though I can't perceive it, I am the recipient of an enormous amount of spiritual support coming from good, loving, angelic spirits, and even the divine itself, through my own sense of self that is wanting the what's best for me, and is guiding me through what Swedenborg calls providence to be on this path, on this journey of development, and being sort of joyfully engaged in life. And so when you just, when I was in my journey of healing and kind of the worst of it, it's like you can feel like you don't have any control over your thoughts, that you are completely at the mercy of these waves of experiences. And so even in that moment, any awareness of even reflecting on your experience and identifying the state that you're in is huge for letting a little bit of light in, like, okay, I'm in a horrible state right now, but then even in whatever, capacity that you have, to know that that's one state that doesn't define the totality of you, so that you can, that there is this whole sort of behind the scenes spiritual loving support system that's helping you through whatever is the worst experience that you're having in the moment. And then in a more proactive way, if you feel like you have any agency in your life, it would be doing anything that makes you feel more playfully connected. Like if you're gonna just meditate, obviously, like a fun way we've shared it on this YouTube channel called Off the Left Eye is like, we can give, you can, because what Swedenborg says is like, you have to we create the space that the influence of angels can flow into, and so, and then even that us, when we do engage with that connection, it actually feeds angels, like it's this reciprocity of love and support and stuff. So it's like, surround yourself with the kinds of things that do connect you with the sense of that angelic support. So for me, that has been meditation, or for some people, it's like going in nature. Like you just have these ways that help remind you of that truth. And that's probably like the biggest impact in terms of ROI. I would say it's actually sitting in meditation for even like 5 minutes a day. And even if that's just being quiet and sort of from this intention or acknowledgement of, I know I'm connecting with this larger spiritual reality that is actually guided by divine love itself, then that's going to start creating magic in your life. You're going to start having the recognition in the other moments when you are at your sort of lowest point of the day and like a little bit more light comes through. So it's like us just having this openness or a willingness and sort of taking any action in our life that supports that starts a whole new momentum going that it will just continue to open and expand. Yeah.
Yes, and looking for the benevolence, and it can be hard sometimes to identify, but with the benefit of having lived a few years now, I look back and I see things that I thought were absolute disasters were actually beneficial to me. And what Bob mentioned about how even what you might consider the worst parts of yourself, the parts you're most ashamed of, the aspect or behaviors or whatever that you most don't want other people to find out about, your deepest, darkest secrets. The idea that that's trying to help in some way. It's trying to distract you from something else or solve a problem or whatever. That there is a benevolence, and the fact that healing is trying to happen. And I guess above all, I would just reiterate what Bob said about that idea that there's a part of you that's absolutely unstained by anything you've ever been through, anything you've ever done to somebody else, or anything that's happened. There's a part that's pure. Swedenborg has a quote that says that gold is still gold, whether it's shining or whether it's covered with soot. It still has that purity at the center of it, and those are all, I think, positive tools for the psychology in the moment.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for this conversation today. I'll sort of send a thank you out through the ether to Bob as well. Your book is Opening the Inner World, Spiritual Healing, Internal Family Systems, and Emmanuel Swedenborg. Where can people get your book, and where would you recommend they go if they'd like to learn more about what you're doing collectively and independently?
Yeah. So the book is available on Amazon. That's certainly the easiest place. But if you don't want to go that route, it's also available on the Swedenborg Foundation's website, which is swedenborg.com. And also there, the Swedenborg Foundation makes all of Swedenborg's works available as a free download. And then there's lots of articles on the Swedenborg Foundation website that you can just go hang out there for a while and explore different avenues in terms of history or topics or things about Swedenborg's worldview that he wrote about. And in time, the Swedenborg Foundation is also going to be offering more courses on IFS and Swedenborg, like wanting to make this really practical for people. And we offered one retreat that I had the pleasure of facilitating in August called the Inflow Retreat. So there will be more offerings in that vein. And so joining our email list there at the Swedenborg Foundation website would be the easiest way to stay in touch about those future offerings as they become available. And like I mentioned, there's the YouTube channel Off the Left Eye that has an enormous archive of videos that explore Swedenborg's ideas from a kind of just modern spiritual exploration standpoint. So, yeah.
No notes. I have nothing to add. That was good.
Okay, well, excellent. I'll make sure links to that are in the show notes of this episode at jamesjesso.com, easily accessible through whatever podcatcher you, the listener, are catching this interview on. Jonathan Chelsea. Oh my goodness. Jonathan Chelsea, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. This has been such a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
And cut. Okay, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. The links you just heard mentioned on how to follow more of, learn more about Swedenborg and to get a copy of this book here, Opening the Inner World, Spiritual Healing and Internal Family Systems, and Emmanuel Swedenborg. They're going to be in the description to this episode, as well as links to Bob's work. He was not there at the end of the interview, as you know, so I'll make sure I retroactively included links to follow him. So go check them out. They're great. I really enjoyed this book, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like I said in the beginning, in the middle, a couple of things. One, follow me. I'm around. Links to do the following is in the description. Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, Blue Sky, Facebook, all that, Telegram, newsletters, all the rest. And you can also subscribe to the show, which would be fantastic on your favorite podcatcher platform. Or you could support the show by becoming a patron or by leaving a one-time donation, a little tip in my direction for a job well done if you perceive the done job good. And that's all. Links to all of that, like I said, are in the description. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind all the way to the end. I've been your host, James Jesso. And until the next episode, take care and stay curious.